"You're worth less than a rusty pan," the gold baron laughed, until she claimed his richest mine. The October sun hung low over Sacramento like a brass coin tossed carelessly into muddy water. Eleanor Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the carriage window, watching the chaos of California's gold rush capital unfold before her refined Boston sensibilities. Men in torn flannel shirts stumbled between ramshackle buildings, their faces weathered by sun and desperation. The air reeked of horse manure, unwashed bodies, and something else, something that made her stomach clench with equal parts revulsion and determination. "Ma'am, you certain about this?" The driver's voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many Eastern ladies step into Sacramento's mud and never emerge clean. "Ain't no place for a proper woman like yourself." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the leather satchel in her lap. Inside lay documents that had shattered her comfortable widow's life 6 months ago. Papers that proved her dear Henry had been far more than the respectable Boston merchant she'd buried with tears and dignity. "I'm quite certain, Mr. Holbrook." She straightened her black mourning dress, the silk an absurd contrast to the rough canvas and denim surrounding them. "Please stop at the Golden Nugget Saloon." The driver's eyebrows shot up like startled birds. "The Nugget? Ma'am, that's where Cornelius Blackwood conducts his business." "Yes, I'm aware." The carriage lurched to a stop before a 2-story structure that might have been impressive if it weren't coated in 3 inches of Sacramento Valley dust. Piano music leaked through batwing doors, accompanied by raucous laughter and the occasional crash of breaking glass. Eleanor had read about such establishments in the penny papers back home, but seeing one felt like stepping into a dime novel. She gathered her skirts and stepped down into the mud without waiting for assistance. Her black boots, practical leather she'd purchased specifically for this journey, sank slightly into the muck. The sound of her footsteps seemed to echo louder than the saloon's cacophony as she approached those forbidding doors. The conversations died first, then the piano. By the time Eleanor pushed through the batwings, the Golden Nugget had fallen silent as a church on Monday morning. 40 pairs of eyes followed her progress across the sawdust-covered floor. She took in the scene with the quick assessment of a woman who'd run a proper household for 30 years. Spittoons that hadn't been emptied in days, tables sticky with spilled whiskey, and paintings of barely clothed women that would have scandalized her Boston neighbors. At the far end of the room, holding court at a round table like some frontier king, sat the man she'd traveled 3,000 miles to confront. Cornelius Blackwood was exactly what she'd expected, and nothing like she'd imagined. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a fine wool coat that couldn't quite hide the coarseness underneath. Gold rings glittered on fingers thick as sausages, and a watch chain stretched across his considerable belly. His beard was trimmed, but his eyes held the calculated cruelty of a man who'd clawed his way to power and enjoyed the view from the top. Those eyes fixed on Eleanor with the interest of a cat discovering a new species of mouse. "Well, I'll be damned," Blackwood's voice carried across the silent saloon like rolling thunder. He set down his whiskey glass with deliberate care. "Boys, we got ourselves some genuine Eastern refinement." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Eleanor forced herself to walk steadily toward his table, her heels clicking against the wooden floor like a metronome counting down to judgment. "You lost, lady?" Blackwood's smile revealed teeth stained brown by tobacco. "Nearest church is 6 blocks east, though I reckon you might be looking for the temperance meeting. That'd be in the next county over." More laughter, bolder now. Eleanor stopped 3 feet from his table and opened her satchel. The rustling of papers seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed saloon. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume?" Her voice carried the crisp authority of a woman who'd managed charity committees and social gatherings with equal efficiency. "I am Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore of Boston." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. "Eleanor Whitmore." He rolled the name around his mouth like he was tasting wine. "Can't say the name rings any bells, but you're a long way from Beacon Hill, Mrs. Whitmore." "Indeed I am." Eleanor placed a leather portfolio on his table right beside his whiskey glass. "I've come about my late husband's business interests." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Blackwood's eyes narrowed to slits, and Eleanor caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way a predator tensed before striking. "Business interests." His laugh started as a chuckle and built to a roar that shook dust from the ceiling beams. "Lady, this ain't Boston. We don't do business with women out here. Hell, most of the time we barely do business with men. You're in gold country now. This is a man's world, built by men's sweat and men's blood." He stood slowly, his considerable frame casting Eleanor in shadow. "You want my advice? Take that pretty carriage back to the station and catch the next train east. 'Cause out here," he gestured broadly at the saloon full of hard-faced men, "out here you're worth less than a rusty pan." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She'd expected hostility, even rudeness. But the casual dismissal in his voice, the certainty that she was nothing, sparked something she hadn't felt since Henry's death. Anger, pure, righteous fury that burned away 6 months of grief and uncertainty. "Mr. Blackwood," her voice cut through his laughter like a blade, "I suggest you examine these documents before you make any more assumptions about my worth." She opened the portfolio and spread its contents across his table. Legal papers, correspondence, and most damning of all, a contract bearing 2 signatures. Henry Whitmore's careful script and Blackwood's bold scrawl. The laughter died in Blackwood's throat. His eyes darted across the documents, and Eleanor watched his face transform from smug dismissal to stunned recognition, to something approaching fear. "Where did you get these?" His voice had dropped to a whisper. "My husband's private safe." Eleanor's tone remained level, but inside her heart hammered like a hummingbird's wings. The safe he thought no one else knew about. The one hidden behind our library's false wall. Blackwood snatched up the contract, his rings clicking against the paper. The silence in the saloon had grown so complete Eleanor could hear her own breathing. "This contract," she continued, "establishes my late husband as your silent partner in the Golden Hope mine. 40% ownership, as I understand it. Which means, Mr. Blackwood, that 40% of your richest claim now belongs to me." The color drained from Blackwood's face like water from a broken dam. Around them, the saloon's patrons began to murmur, a low buzz of excitement and disbelief. "That's—" Blackwood's voice cracked slightly. "That's impossible. Henry never said nothing about no wife. My husband was a very private man." Eleanor began gathering the papers with steady hands, though her pulse raced. He believed in keeping his business and domestic lives separate. Clearly, he was more successful at this than I realized. She closed the portfolio and looked directly into Blackwood's eyes. "I'll be staying at Mrs. O'Sullivan's boarding house on Front Street. I suggest you have your attorney review these documents and prepare a full accounting of the mine's profits for the past 3 years. I'll expect this information within the week." Eleanor turned to leave, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes tracking her movement. She'd made it halfway to the door when Blackwood's voice stopped her cold. "Mrs. Whitmore." She turned back. His smile had returned, but now it held all the warmth of a January wind. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The threat hung in the tobacco-scented air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Eleanor met his stare without flinching, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "We'll see about that, Mr. Blackwood." She pushed through the batwing doors and stepped back into the chaos of Sacramento's streets. Only when the carriage door closed behind her did she allow her hands to shake. Mrs. Mary O'Sullivan's boarding house squatted between a barber shop and a general store like a hen protecting her chicks. The building's paint had long since surrendered to California's sun, leaving it the color of old bones, but the windows gleamed and the front porch swept clean, small victories against the frontier's endless appetite for decay. Eleanor climbed the steps with her single traveling trunk, her confidence from the saloon already beginning to fray at the edges. What had possessed her to challenge a man like Blackwood in front of half the town? In Boston, such matters were handled through lawyers and correspondence, not dramatic confrontations in establishments that respectable women didn't even acknowledge existed. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a woman who might have been carved from the same practical wood as her porch. Mary O'Sullivan stood barely 5 feet tall, but she radiated the kind of competence that came from surviving everything the world could throw at her and asking for seconds. "You'll be Mrs. Whitmore." Mary's accent carried the lilting cadence of County Cork, softened by years in America but never fully tamed. "Saw you getting out of that fancy carriage. Come in then, before every gossip in Sacramento gets a good look at you." Eleanor stepped into a hallway that smelled of lemon oil and fresh bread, a shocking contrast to the chaos outside. The floors gleamed with polish, and white lace curtains filtered the afternoon light into something approaching genteel. "This is lovely," Eleanor said, meaning it. "How did you know I was coming?" Mary's laugh had a knowing edge. "Word travels faster than wildfire in this town. Heard you had yourself a chat with Cornelius Blackwood not 20 minutes ago." She studied Eleanor with sharp green eyes. "Also heard you lived to tell about it. That makes you either very brave or very foolish." "Perhaps both." Eleanor set down her reticule, suddenly exhausted by the weight of her own audacity. "I'm hoping for brave." "Brave'll get you killed out here just as quick as foolish." Mary picked up Eleanor's trunk as if it weighed nothing. "But it might get you somewhere first. This way." She led Eleanor up a narrow staircase to a small but immaculate room overlooking Front Street. A brass bed dominated the space, covered with a quilt that showed the kind of careful needlework Eleanor associated with long winter evenings and patient hands. A washstand, a chest of drawers, and a single chair completed the furnishings. "It ain't the Palmer house," Mary said, "but it's clean and the roof don't leak. Meals are served at 7, 12, and 6. No men upstairs, no drinking in the rooms, and no loud music after 10 o'clock. Can you live with those rules?" "Gladly." Eleanor sat heavily on the bed, her traveling dress suddenly feeling like it weighed 50 pounds. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, may I ask you something?" "Ask away. Can't promise I'll answer." "What do you know about Cornelius Blackwood?" Mary's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the Sierra Nevada. She closed the door and leaned against it, as if the simple act of speaking the man's name might summon him. "What's to know? He owns half the gold claims in the county, the other half of the town, and most of the men in between." Her voice carried the bitterness of old wounds. "Come out here in 49 with nothing but the clothes on his back and the devil's own luck at finding color. Now he's got more money than Midas and twice the appetite for power." Eleanor heard something personal in Mary's tone, a pain that went beyond general dislike. Did he hurt you?" Mary's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Hurt me? No, Mrs. Whitmore. He killed my husband." The words dropped into the quiet room like stones into still water. Eleanor felt her throat constrict. "Oh, Mary, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "Course you didn't." Mary moved to the window, her back straight as a soldier's. "Happened 2 years ago. My Patrick had a claim up at Bear Creek. Nothing fancy, but it was putting food on our table, and a bit extra besides. Then Blackwood decided he wanted that stretch of river." She traced a pattern on the window pane with her finger. "Started with offers. Patrick said no. Then came threats. Patrick still said no. Then one night, Patrick went to check his sluices and never came home. Sheriff found him floating downstream 3 days later. Called it an accident. But you don't believe that." Mary turned back to Eleanor, her eyes bright with unshed tears and suppressed rage. "Patrick could swim like a fish and knew every rock in that creek. But the sheriff's in Blackwood's pocket, same as the judge and half the town council. Nobody was going to listen to an Irish widow's complaints." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Mary, perhaps I should reconsider this whole endeavor. If Blackwood is truly that dangerous, don't you dare. Mary's voice cracked like a whip. You think I've been waiting 2 years for Justice to walk in here wearing Boston silk just so she can turn tail at the first sign of trouble? She crossed to Eleanor and gripped her shoulders with surprisingly strong hands. Listen to me, Mrs. Whitmore. Men like Blackwood only understand one thing: power. The power to take what they want when they want it, from whoever's too weak to stop them. But here's what they don't understand. Sometimes the weak ones ain't as weak as they look. Eleanor met Mary's fierce gaze and felt something stir inside her chest, something that had been dormant since Henry's death. Purpose, direction, the sense of having a fight worth fighting. What do you suggest I do? Mary released her shoulders and smiled, the first genuine warmth Eleanor had seen from her. First thing, get out of that mourning dress. Black makes you look like a professional mourner, and that ain't gonna serve you out here. Second, we need to find you some allies. Allies? Honey, you just declared war on the most powerful man in 3 counties. You think he's gonna fight fair? Mary moved to the chest of drawers and began pulling out simple brown dresses and practical aprons. Blackwood's got money, influence, and a dozen men who'd cut their own mothers' throats for a gold eagle. What have you got? Eleanor considered this soberly. Legal documents and 40% ownership in what I'm told is a very profitable mine. Papers can be burned, ownership can be disputed. What else? Eleanor faltered. What did she have? A comfortable life back in Boston, but that felt like another woman's memory now. Some money from Henry's estate, but not enough to fight a prolonged legal battle against unlimited resources. I'm not sure. Mary tossed a brown wool dress onto the bed. Then we'd better figure it out quick, because if I know Blackwood, and I do, he's already planning his next move. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the street below. Eleanor joined Mary at the window and saw 3 riders stopping in front of the boarding house. Hard-looking men with rifles across their saddles and the casual bearing of violence that seemed endemic to the territory. The leader, a lean man with a face like a hatchet and eyes the color of old copper, dismounted and handed his reins to one of his companions. He wore his guns low on his hips in the manner of someone who'd found frequent use for them. Jake Morrison, Mary whispered, Blackwood's left hand. If he's here, it means your little chat this afternoon rattled the boss more than he let on. Morrison's boots rang on the porch steps. The front door opened and closed with deliberate care, the sound of a man making his presence known without seeming threatening. His voice carried clearly up the stairs. Mrs. O'Sullivan, got a message for your new guest. Mary squeezed Eleanor's arm. Stay here. Don't say nothing, don't do nothing, just listen. She opened the bedroom door and called down. She ain't seeing visitors, Jake. Try again tomorrow. Now, Mary, that ain't neighborly. Morrison's tone held false friendliness, wrapped around a core of iron. Mr. Blackwood just wants to make sure Mrs. Whitmore understands her situation. Wouldn't want any misunderstandings. Eleanor heard Mary's footsteps on the stairs, measured and steady. And what situation would that be? Well, seems the lady's got some documents that might not be entirely authentic. Mr. Blackwood's concerned someone might be trying to take advantage of her grief. You know how it is, unscrupulous folks preying on widows. The calculation in his voice made Eleanor's skin crawl. Blackwood was already spinning the narrative, painting her as either a fool or a fraud. That's mighty considerate of him, Mary replied, her tone matching Morrison's false cordiality. I'll be sure to pass along his concerns. See that you do. And Mary, might want to remind your guest that sometimes folks who dig where they shouldn't, well, sometimes they find more than they bargained for. The front door closed with finality. Eleanor remained frozen at the window until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the evening bustle of Front Street. Mary returned, her face grim. Well, that was quicker than I expected. What did he mean about the documents not being authentic? Means Blackwood's gonna claim your husband's papers are forgeries. Probably already got his tame judge ready to rule in his favor. Mary began pacing the small room like a caged animal. We need help. Someone who knows the law and ain't afraid to use it. A lawyer. The lawyer. Tom Brennan. Used to be district attorney before Blackwood destroyed his career. He's got a grudge the size of the Sierra Nevadas and skills to match. Eleanor felt a flutter of hope. Will he help us? Mary's expression became complicated. That depends. Tom's got what you might call a drinking problem these days. But underneath all that whiskey, he's still the smartest legal mind between San Francisco and Carson City. Question is whether we can sober him up long enough to be useful. She moved to the door. Get some rest, Mrs. Whitmore. Tomorrow we start fighting back. And please, call me Mary. We're in this together now, and I got a feeling it's going to get worse before it gets better. After Mary left, Eleanor sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of Sacramento settling into evening. Somewhere out there, Cornelius Blackwood was planning his next move. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt something she hadn't experienced since Henry's death, the electric thrill of being truly alive. She rose and began changing out of her morning dress. Mary was right about the black. It was time to stop looking like a victim and start looking like a woman who intended to fight for what was rightfully hers, even if that fight killed her. The building that housed Thomas Brennan's law office, if the term could be applied to 2 rooms above Chen's laundry, looked like it was maintained through willpower and spite alone. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips and the wooden sign reading T. Brennan, attorney at law, hung at such an angle that it suggested the entire structure might be drunk. Eleanor climbed the narrow external staircase with Mary close behind, both women dressed in the practical brown woolens Mary had insisted upon. The morning air carried the scent of lye soap from below and something less pleasant from the street. Sacramento never stopped reminding visitors that civilization here was still more aspiration than achievement. "You sure about this?" Mary asked as they reached the landing. "Tom's been known to conduct business in his undergarments when he's deep in his cups." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "If he's the only lawyer in town who isn't beholden to Blackwood, then he's our only hope." She knocked on the door marked private and waited. Silence. Then a crash, followed by creative profanity that would have made a sailor blush. The door opened to reveal a man who might once have been handsome, but had clearly entered into extended negotiations with whiskey and lost every round. Thomas Brennan stood perhaps 6 feet tall when sober, which, judging by his current state, hadn't been recently. His dark hair hung limp across his forehead, and 3 days of stubble-covered cheeks that had the sallow complexion of someone who considered alcohol a food group. His shirt was wrinkled but clean, his trousers held up by suspenders, and his eyes were the pale blue of winter sky and held an intelligence that not even years of dedicated drinking had entirely dimmed. "Mrs. O'Sullivan." His voice carried the cultured tones of Eastern education, softened by whatever Irish ancestry had gifted him his surname. "To what do I owe the unexpected pleasure?" "Tom Brennan, meet Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore of Boston." Mary pushed past him into the office. "She's got a legal problem that might interest you." Brennan's gaze sharpened as it settled on Eleanor. She felt oddly self-conscious under his scrutiny, as if he could see through the practical dress to the frightened widow beneath. "Boston, you say?" He gestured them into chairs that had seen better decades. "Haven't encountered someone from the hub in quite some time. What brings you to our fair, and I use the term loosely, city?" The office was larger than Eleanor had expected, but filled with the detritus of a once promising career. Law books sat spine-deep in dust, and papers covered every available surface like fallen snow. A bottle of whiskey occupied the place of honor on his desk, surrounded by empty glasses and cold coffee cups. Eleanor carefully arranged Henry's documents across the only clear space available. "Mr. Brennan, I need to establish my legal ownership of a mining claim." Brennan leaned forward, his attention suddenly focused with laser intensity. He examined each document carefully, occasionally making notes on a scrap of paper. The change in his demeanor was remarkable. The drunk had vanished, replaced by the keen legal mind Mary had promised. Fascinating. He picked up the partnership agreement between Henry and Blackwood. This is Cornelius Blackwood's signature? So I'm told. And your husband never mentioned this arrangement? Eleanor chose her words carefully. My husband was a private man who believed in keeping his business affairs separate from his domestic life. I discovered these documents 6 months after his death. Brennan nodded thoughtfully. The Golden Hope Mine. Yes, I'm familiar with it. One of the richest claims in the county. He looked up at her with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, do you understand what you're attempting? I'm not attempting anything, Mr. Brennan. I'm asserting my legal rights as my husband's heir. Against Cornelius Blackwood. His laugh held no humor. The man who owns half of Sacramento and most of the men who run the other half, including, I should mention, Judge Harrison, who would hear any case you might bring. Mary leaned forward. That's where you come in, Tom. We need someone who knows the law well enough to fight dirty. Dirty? Brennan reached for the whiskey bottle, then seemed to think better of it. My dear Mary, fighting dirty against Cornelius Blackwood is like bringing a knife to a cannon battle. The man doesn't just bend the law, he owns it. Eleanor felt her carefully constructed courage beginning to crack. Then you won't help us? Brennan was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with the expression of a man weighing his soul against his chances of survival. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, I was the district attorney for this county. Good at my job, too. Had a wife, a house, and what you might call prospects. He gestured at the shabby office around them. Then I made the mistake of investigating some irregularities in certain mining claims, irregularities that led back to a certain powerful individual. Eleanor's heart sank. Blackwood destroyed your career. Destroyed my career, my marriage, and my reputation. Had me thrown in jail on fabricated charges, then made sure every door in California was closed to me. His hand trembled slightly as he reached again for the bottle. So you ask if I'll help you fight the man who took everything from me? The answer is complicated. Complicated how? Mary's voice was sharp with impatience. Brennan poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey but didn't drink it. Instead, he stared into the amber liquid as if it held answers to questions he'd stopped asking. On one hand, I'd like nothing more than to see Cornelius Blackwood brought low. On the other hand, I've grown rather fond of being alive, even if it's not much of a life. He looked up at Eleanor. What makes you think you can succeed where I failed? Eleanor considered her answer carefully. Because I have something you didn't, Mr. Brennan. I have legitimate legal documents proving ownership. And because, she paused, surprising herself with what she was about to say, because I have nothing left to lose. The truth of that statement hit her like a physical blow. Henry was dead. Her comfortable Boston life was sold or left behind. Her reputation among the social circles that had defined her existence was already compromised by this Western adventure. She'd burned her bridges as thoroughly as Sherman marching through Georgia. Nothing left to lose, Brennan repeated, rolling the words around his mouth like wine. That's either very liberating or very dangerous. Maybe both. He lifted the whiskey glass, held it to the light from the grimy window, then set it down untouched. Your documents appear genuine. The partnership agreement is properly notarized and filed. If this were anywhere else in the country, you'd have a solid case. But this isn't anywhere else. No, this is California, where justice is whatever the man with the most gold says it is. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously. However, there might be a way. Mary straightened. What kind of way? A public trial. Not in Harrison's chambers where he can rule however Blackwood wants, but in front of the whole town. Make it a spectacle, draw attention from San Francisco, maybe even get some of those newspaper men involved. His eyes began to glitter with something approaching enthusiasm. Blackwood thrives in shadows. Drag him into the light, and he might not look so invincible. Eleanor felt a flutter of hope. Could such a thing work? It's been done before. California law allows for public trials in civil matters, especially when there's sufficient community interest. Brennan finally lifted the whiskey glass and drained it in one gulp. Of course, it would require someone willing to stand up in front of God and everyone and accuse Cornelius Blackwood of fraud. I'll do it. The words were out of Eleanor's mouth before she'd consciously decided to speak them. Both Mary and Brennan stared at her as if she'd just volunteered to wrestle a grizzly bear. "Mrs. Whitmore," Brennan said carefully, "you do understand that once we file this petition, there's no going back? Blackwood will come at you with everything he has. Your reputation, your safety, your very life could be in jeopardy." Eleanor thought of Henry's secret life, of the comfortable lies she'd built her existence around, of the woman she'd been just a week ago who worried about proper tea service and charitable committee meetings. That woman felt as distant as a character from a novel. "Mr. Brennan, 6 months ago my husband died, and I discovered that everything I thought I knew about my life was built on careful omissions and outright deceptions. I came west to find answers, and instead I found something I didn't know I was looking for, which is myself." She began gathering up the documents with steady hands. "Can you file the petition today?" Brennan and Mary exchanged a look that Eleanor couldn't interpret. Finally, the lawyer reached for a clean sheet of paper and dipped his pen in ink. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish, possibly both." He began writing in the precise script of legal training. "But yes, I can file the petition today. Fair warning, though. Once this becomes public knowledge, Blackwood's response will be swift and probably violent. Then we'd better be ready for him." As Brennan worked, Eleanor moved to the grimy window and looked down at Sacramento's muddy streets. Somewhere out there, Cornelius Blackwood was conducting his business, secure in his power, and confident in his ability to crush any challenge to his authority. He was about to discover that Boston widows could be more dangerous than he'd imagined. Eleanor had expected Blackwood's retaliation to be swift, but she hadn't anticipated it would come at 3 o'clock in the morning in the form of flames licking at her bedroom window. She woke to Mary's urgent shaking and the acrid smell of smoke. "Fire! Get up, get dressed, grab what you can." Eleanor's mind struggled to process what was happening as she stumbled from bed, still wearing the simple cotton nightgown Mary had insisted she purchase. Through her window, she could see orange light dancing against the buildings across Front Street, but the flames seemed oddly contained, more like a controlled burn than a true conflagration. "Is it the boarding house?" Eleanor asked, pulling on the practical brown dress she'd worn the day before. "No." Mary's voice was grim as she stuffed Eleanor's legal documents into the leather satchel. "It's Brennan's office." Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. "Tom?" "Don't know, come on." They rushed downstairs and onto Front Street, joining a growing crowd of people drawn by the spectacular flames consuming the building above Chen's Laundry. The fire had clearly been set with professional skill, hot enough and fast enough to destroy everything in Brennan's office, but contained enough to avoid spreading to neighboring buildings. Eleanor scanned the crowd frantically until she spotted a familiar figure standing well back from the fire, a bottle clutched in his right hand and defeat written across his face in the dancing orange light. "Tom!" She pushed through the crowd to reach him. "Thank God you're alive." Brennan looked at her with eyes that held no surprise, only a terrible weariness. Alive, yes. Useful, no. He gestured at the burning building with his bottle. "Everything's gone. All my law books, my files, 3 years of notes on Blackwood's operations, even my spare clothes. But you're safe. That's what matters." His laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Safe. Mrs. Whitmore, this is just the beginning. Blackwood's sending us a message. He can reach us whenever he wants, destroy whatever we build, hurt whomever we care about." Eleanor watched the flames consume what had been their best hope for legal recourse. Around them, the crowd buzzed with the kind of excitement that came from witnessing someone else's misfortune. She caught fragments of conversation, speculation about the cause, bets on whether the fire would spread, and underneath it all, the subtle current of fear that ran through any community controlled by men like Blackwood. "Mrs. Whitmore?" She turned to find a young man in a clean but simple suit, his face earnest behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He carried a notebook and pencil in the manner of someone whose business was recording events rather than participating in them. "I'm Samuel Morrison from the Sacramento Union. I understand you're the lady who's been having legal difficulties with Cornelius Blackwood." Eleanor felt Mary tense beside her. The last thing they needed was publicity that would paint them as troublemakers or attention seekers. But looking at the young reporter's honest face, she made a decision that surprised even herself. "Mr. Morrison, I'm a widow from Boston, attempting to claim legal ownership of property that rightfully belongs to me. Unfortunately, certain powerful interests seem determined to prevent me from exercising my legal rights." Morrison scribbled rapidly. "And you believe tonight's fire is connected to your legal claims?" "I believe," Eleanor said carefully, "that it's quite a coincidence that the office of the one lawyer willing to represent me should burn down less than 24 hours after we filed our petition. That's a serious accusation, ma'am." Eleanor looked at the dying flames, then back at the reporter. "Mr. Morrison, I'm a respectable widow who's never broken a law in her life. I came to California with legitimate documents proving my husband's business partnership, seeking only what the law says belongs to me. If that threatens certain people enough to resort to arson, what does that tell you about the validity of my claim?" Morrison continued writing. "Do you have any proof that Mr. Blackwood was involved in tonight's fire?" Before Eleanor could answer, a new voice cut through the crowd's murmur like a blade through silk. "That's a hell of an accusation to make without any evidence." The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Cornelius Blackwood approached, flanked by two of his men. He was impeccably dressed despite the late hour, pressed trousers, clean white shirt, and that familiar air of absolute confidence. His eyes found Eleanor's across the space between them and held them with the intensity of a snake mesmerizing a bird. "Mr. Blackwood," Morrison said, raising his pencil, "any comment on tonight's fire?" "Terrible tragedy," Blackwood replied, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "Poor Tom there has been struggling with his drinking problem for years. Probably fell asleep with a lit cigarette. Amazing he got out alive." Brennan started forward, his fists clenched, but Mary caught his arm. "Don't give him what he wants, Tom." Blackwood's smile widened as he watched the exchange. Of course, if someone was spreading lies about respectable businessmen being involved in arson, well, that might be considered slander, criminal slander, in fact. The threat hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Eleanor felt every eye in the crowd turn to her, waiting to see how a Boston widow would respond to such naked intimidation. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying with surprising clarity, "I haven't accused you of anything. I simply pointed out that it's remarkably convenient timing." Convenient for who? For anyone who might benefit from destroying legal documents that prove uncomfortable truths. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Blackwood's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold as winter stars. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're clearly distraught by this tragedy, understandable given your delicate condition." His tone dripped false sympathy. "Perhaps you should return to Boston, where you can recover from your grief in more suitable surroundings." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied, "you should concern yourself with your own affairs, rather than offering unsolicited advice to grieving widows." A murmur ran through the crowd, part admiration, part shock that anyone would speak to Blackwood so boldly. Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of stares and realized that this moment would define how she was perceived by the entire town. She could back down, accept his implicit offer of safe passage home, and return to Boston with her tail between her legs. Or she could stand her ground and accept whatever consequences followed. "My affairs are perfectly in order," Blackwood said, unlike certain fraudulent documents that seem to have materialized from thin air. "Fraudulent?" Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Are you suggesting that my husband's legal papers are forgeries?" "I'm not suggesting anything, ma'am. I'm stating a fact. Henry Whitmore and I had no business relationship. Any documents claiming otherwise are either mistaken or deliberately falsified." Morrison's pencil flew across his notebook. This was clearly more drama than he'd expected when he'd followed the fire alarm. Eleanor opened her satchel and withdrew the leather portfolio that contained her husband's documents. "Then perhaps you can explain why this document bears your signature, Mr. Blackwood?" She held the paper up so the crowd could see it, though few of them could read the elegant script from their distance. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he focused on the document. "I've never seen that paper before in my life." "Really? Because it appears to be signed by your hand and witnessed by Jacob Morse, your accountant." At the mention of Morse's name, Eleanor caught a flicker of something in Blackwood's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or concern. The reaction was so brief she might have imagined it, but it gave her hope. "Mrs. Whitmore," Blackwood's voice had gone dangerously quiet, "you're making very serious accusations based on documents of questionable authenticity. I'd be careful about pursuing this line of inquiry." "Is that a threat?" "It's friendly advice, the kind a concerned citizen might offer to a confused widow who's clearly been taken advantage of by unscrupulous individuals." Eleanor felt the crowd's attention like a physical weight. This was her moment. The chance to establish herself as someone who wouldn't be intimidated, or the moment she would be branded as a hysterical woman making wild accusations. "Mr. Blackwood, the only person who seems confused here is you. These documents are perfectly authentic, properly notarized and filed with the county clerk as of yesterday afternoon. If you'd like to examine them more closely, I suggest you have your lawyer schedule a meeting with mine." "You don't have a lawyer," Blackwood said smugly. "Tom Brennan just lost his license to practice law, along with everything else." Eleanor's heart sank, but she kept her expression steady. "Then I'll find another one. There are surely honest attorneys in Sacramento." Blackwood's laugh was ugly. "Good luck with that search. You might have to look as far as San Francisco to find someone willing to take your case." He turned to address the crowd, raising his voice to carry to the furthest listeners. "Folks, I want you all to witness what you've seen here tonight. A confused widow from back east making wild accusations against upstanding citizens based on questionable documents. It's a sad situation, and I hope Mrs. Whitmore gets the help she clearly needs." The crowd began to disperse, the excitement of the fire and confrontation giving way to the practical need for sleep before tomorrow's work. Eleanor watched them go with a sinking heart, realizing that Blackwood had just painted her as either a fool or a fraud in front of half the town. "Come on," Mary said quietly. "Nothing more to be accomplished here." As they walked back toward the boarding house, Eleanor heard footsteps behind them. She turned to find Morrison hurrying to catch up. "Mrs. Whitmore, might I have a word?" Eleanor glanced at Mary, who shrugged. "What is it, Mr. Morrison?" "I've been covering the mining beat for 2 years now, and I've heard stories. Rumors about claims being jumped, documents disappearing, people who ask too many questions suddenly finding themselves on the wrong end of accidents." He lowered his voice. "I'm not saying any of it's true, you understand, but if even half the stories are accurate, what are you trying to tell me?" Morrison glanced around nervously. "Just that you should be very careful, ma'am. Very careful indeed." He hurried away into the darkness, leaving Eleanor with the unsettling feeling that she'd just been given a warning by someone who knew more than he was willing to say. The next morning brought news that Eleanor's petition had been accepted by the court, despite Tom Brennan's sudden inability to represent her. Judge Harrison had scheduled a hearing for the following week, which Mary declared was either remarkably fast or suspiciously convenient. "Harrison's moving this along quick-like," Mary said over breakfast in the boarding house's small dining room. "Either he wants to get it over with fast, or Blackwood's told him to rule against you and be done with it." Eleanor picked at her eggs and bacon, her appetite diminished by the previous night's events. "Do you think we can find another lawyer willing to take the case? In a week, with Blackwood's reputation for making life difficult for anyone who crosses him?" Mary shook her head. Not likely. Then what do we do? Before Mary could answer, their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Mary rose to answer it, returning moments later with a small, nervous-looking man in a clerk's suit. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Jacob Morse. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. I believe my name was mentioned last night in your discussion with Mr. Blackwood. Eleanor's heart began to race. Morse was Blackwood's accountant, the man whose signature appeared as witness on Henry's partnership agreement. Mr. Morse, please sit down. Morse remained standing, his eyes darting toward the windows as if he expected to see hostile faces pressed against the glass. I can't stay long. If Mr. Blackwood knew I was here, what did you want to tell us? Morse reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather ledger. I've been keeping books for Mr. Blackwood for 5 years. I know where every dollar comes from and where it goes. He set the ledger on the table with trembling hands. 3 years ago, Mr. Blackwood received a substantial investment from an Eastern gentleman. The money saved his operation from bankruptcy and allowed him to expand his claims throughout the county. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Henry Whitmore? The very same. I processed the paperwork myself, witnessed the partnership agreement, recorded the transactions. Morse's voice dropped to a whisper. Your husband's investment made Mr. Blackwood the most powerful man in 3 counties. Mary leaned forward intently. Then why is Blackwood claiming he never knew Henry? Because your husband included a clause in their agreement that Mr. Blackwood either didn't understand or chose to ignore. The partnership was to be dissolved upon Mr. Whitmore's death, with his share reverting to his heirs. Morse opened the ledger and pointed to a series of entries. Mr. Blackwood has been legally obligated to contact you for 6 months. Instead, he's been hoping you'd never discover the partnership existed. Eleanor stared at the neat columns of figures, each entry a nail in Blackwood's coffin. This proves everything. It proves the financial relationship, Morse corrected, but Mr. Blackwood has been preparing for this possibility. He's had his lawyer draw up documents claiming the partnership was dissolved by mutual consent before your husband's death. Can he do that? He can try, especially with Judge Harrison presiding. Morse closed the ledger. But there's something else you should know. The Golden Hope mine, the one mentioned in your partnership agreement, it's not Blackwood's most valuable property anymore. Mary frowned. What do you mean? Last month, his surveyors discovered a new vein on the property adjacent to Golden Hope, the richest strike anyone's seen since '49. Mr. Blackwood's been quietly buying up surrounding claims, but he can't touch that new vein legally. Eleanor felt a chill of understanding. Because it's on property that's 40% mine. Exactly. That new strike is worth more than everything else he owns combined. He'll do anything to keep you from claiming it. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Eleanor wasn't just fighting for her husband's original investment. She was fighting for a fortune that could reshape the entire region. Mr. Morse, Eleanor said carefully, would you be willing to testify to these facts in court? Morse's face went pale. Mrs. Whitmore, you don't understand what you're asking. Blackwood doesn't just ruin people who cross him, he destroys them completely. I have a wife, children, and they'll never be safe as long as Blackwood has this kind of power over everyone in the county, Mary interjected. This might be the only chance to stop him. Morse stood abruptly, clutching the ledger to his chest. I can't. I'm sorry, but I can't. Eleanor rose as well. Mr. Morse, wait. He paused at the dining room door, his face a mask of fear and guilt. Keep the ledger, Eleanor said. Study it. Think about what kind of world you want your children to grow up in, one where men like Blackwood can take whatever they want through intimidation and violence, or one where the law actually means something. Morse's shoulders sagged. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you to help me prove the truth. That's all. After Morse left, Eleanor and Mary sat in contemplative silence. Finally, Mary spoke. Even with his testimony, we'd still need a lawyer willing to present the case. Eleanor had been thinking the same thing. What about Tom? Even if he can't practice law officially, he could advise us, coach us on legal procedure. Tom's a broken man, Eleanor. Last night finished whatever fight he had left. Eleanor stood and began pacing the small dining room. Then we'll have to find another way. What other way? Eleanor stopped pacing and turned to face Mary with an expression of sudden determination. I'll represent myself. Mary stared at her as if she'd just announced plans to fly to the moon. Eleanor, you can't be serious. Why not? I can read. I can speak in public. I have the truth on my side. You're not a lawyer. Neither was Lincoln when he started. Neither was half the men practicing law in this territory. Eleanor's voice gained strength as the idea took hold. Mary, what do I have to lose? If I don't fight, Blackwood wins by default. If I fight and lose, at least I'll have tried. Mary rubbed her temples as if fighting a headache. Eleanor, representing yourself against Blackwood in Harrison's court would be like taking on a pack of wolves with a butter knife. Then I'll have to be very good with that butter knife. Their debate was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time Mary returned with Tom Brennan, looking remarkably sober for 10 o'clock in the morning. Ladies, he said, settling into a chair without invitation, I've been thinking about our situation. Our situation? Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Blackwood made this personal last night. Burned down everything I had left, thinking it would make me crawl away and hide. Tom's eyes held a clarity Eleanor hadn't seen before. But here's the thing about a man who's lost everything. He's got nothing left to lose. Mary leaned forward. What are you saying, Tom? I'm saying that while I can't officially represent Mrs. Whitmore in court, there's nothing stopping me from advising her, coaching her, helping her prepare her case. Eleanor felt a surge of hope. You do that? Mrs. Whitmore, you're about to walk into that courtroom and take on the most powerful man in 3 counties. You'll be facing a hostile judge, a packed courtroom full of Blackwood's supporters, and legal maneuvering that would challenge an experienced attorney. Tom's smile was grim but determined. You're going to need all the help you can get. What do you suggest? Tom pulled out a battered notebook and a stub of pencil. First, we need to understand exactly what you're up against. Harrison will try to rule against you on technical grounds if possible. Improper procedures, insufficient evidence, anything to avoid addressing the substance of your claim. He began sketching a rough courtroom layout. Second, we need to anticipate Blackwood's strategy. He'll paint you as a grief-stricken widow who's been duped by forged documents. He'll question your husband's character, your own mental state, and the authenticity of every piece of evidence you present. Eleanor felt her courage beginning to waver. It sounds impossible. Not impossible, just very, very difficult. Tom looked up from his sketching. But here's our advantage. Blackwood's gotten lazy. He's been unopposed for so long that he's forgotten how to fight a real battle. He expects intimidation and corruption to carry the day. If we can force him to actually defend his position on the merits, we might have a chance, Mary finished. A small one, Tom cautioned. But a chance nonetheless. Eleanor studied the rough courtroom sketch, imagining herself standing before a hostile crowd, facing down Blackwood and his lawyers with nothing but the truth and whatever legal knowledge Tom could cram into her head in a week. What do we do first? Tom's smile was the first genuine expression of hope she'd seen from him. First, we turn you into a lawyer. For 6 days, Eleanor's world shrank to the confines of Tom Brennan's new temporary office, a corner table in the back room of Chen's laundry, surrounded by borrowed law books and the constant smell of lye soap. Tom had sobered up with remarkable efficiency, channeling his anger over the fire into a focused determination to prepare Eleanor for the legal battle ahead. Remember, Tom said, pacing behind her chair as she practiced her opening statement for the 100th time, Harrison will try to rattle you with objections. Don't let him. When he interrupts, stop talking, look at him respectfully, and wait for his ruling. Never argue with the judge directly. Eleanor nodded, though her head was spinning with legal terminology and procedural rules. And if Blackwood's lawyer objects to our evidence? Anticipate the objection. When you introduce each document, establish its provenance clearly. Who created it, when, where it's been stored, how it came into your possession. Make it harder for them to challenge authenticity. Mary, who had appointed herself Eleanor's moral support and unofficial bodyguard, looked up from the corner where she was mending a tear in Eleanor's courtroom dress, a modest but well-tailored black silk that struck the right balance between respectability and mourning. "What about Morse?" Mary asked. "Any word from him?" Tom shook his head grimly. "Nothing, and I wouldn't count on him showing up voluntarily. Blackwood's had 3 days to work on him." Eleanor felt a stab of disappointment. Morse's testimony would have been crucial, but she couldn't blame him for protecting his family. "We'll have to make our case without him." "Maybe not." Tom stopped pacing and turned to face her. "There's something I haven't told you about legal procedure in territorial courts. If you can demonstrate that a witness has been intimidated or coerced into refusing to testify, the judge can compel their appearance. Can we prove Morse has been intimidated? Not directly, but—" Tom's expression became calculating. "If someone were to visit Morse's home and find evidence of Blackwood's influence, extra guards, unusual visitors, signs of pressure, that might constitute grounds for a subpoena." Eleanor understood immediately. "You want me to spy on Morse. I want you to take a neighborly walk past his house and observe what you see, perfectly innocent behavior for a concerned citizen." Mary stood up, setting aside her sewing. "I'll go with her. 2 women out for an afternoon stroll won't attract attention." An hour later, Eleanor and Mary made their way through Sacramento's residential district, an optimistic term for the collection of hastily built houses and converted commercial buildings where the town's more prosperous citizens lived. Morse's home was a modest 2-story structure with a small garden, distinguished from its neighbors mainly by the 2 hard-faced men sitting on the front porch. "Well, that's subtle," Mary muttered as they approached. The men watched their progress with the professional interest of guards who knew their business. One of them, a thin man with a scar running from his left ear to his collar, stood as they drew near. "Afternoon, ladies. Beautiful day for a walk." "Indeed it is," Eleanor replied pleasantly. "Such a lovely neighborhood. Are you residents here?" The scarred man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just visiting friends. You ladies wouldn't be lost, would you?" "Not at all. We're simply enjoying the fresh air." Through the house's front window, Eleanor caught a glimpse of movement, a woman's figure quickly withdrawn. Mrs. Morse, perhaps, or one of the children Jacob had mentioned. "Well, you enjoy your walk," the guard said. "Might want to stick to the main streets, though. Some of the side roads can be unsafe for unescorted ladies." The message was clear enough. Eleanor and Mary continued their stroll, maintaining casual conversation until they were well out of earshot. "Blackwood's not taking any chances," Mary observed. Eleanor nodded, her mind already working on how to present this information to the court. Tom was right about the intimidation. The question is whether we can prove it legally. And they were so focused on discussing their discovery that neither noticed the figure following them at a discreet distance, a well-dressed man with the patient bearing of someone accustomed to watching and waiting. That evening, as Eleanor reviewed her notes by lamplight in the boarding house's small parlor, Mary burst through the front door with news that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "Fire at Morse's house," Mary announced breathlessly. "Started about an hour ago. The whole family's safe, but the house is gone." Eleanor's papers scattered to the floor as she stood. "Gone. Everything. Everything. Morse, his wife, and kids are staying at his brother's place across town." Mary's expression was grim. "Funny thing, though. The fire started right after we were seen walking past his house." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Blackwood wasn't just preventing Morse from testifying. He was sending a message to anyone else who might consider helping Eleanor. "We have to do something," Eleanor said. This has gone beyond legal maneuvering into outright terrorism. What can we do? We have no proof Blackwood was involved. Eleanor began gathering her scattered papers with trembling hands. Maybe not legal proof, but we have something else. What? Moral authority. If we can show the town what kind of man they're allowing to control their lives. Mary sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Eleanor, you're talking about going up against a man who just burned down a family's home to keep them quiet. What makes you think moral authority will be enough? Eleanor paused in her paper gathering, Tom's words from their first meeting echoing in her mind. Nothing left to lose. The phrase had seemed melodramatic then, but now she understood its terrible freedom. Because, she said finally, somebody has to stand up to him. If not me, then who? If not now, then when? The next morning brought the final day before the trial, and an unexpected visitor. Eleanor was reviewing her opening statement when Tom appeared at the boarding house with a stranger in tow, a well-dressed man with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Eleanor, I'd like you to meet District Attorney William Hayes from San Francisco. Hayes stepped forward with a professional smile. Mrs. Whitmore, I've been following your case with considerable interest. Eleanor's heart leaped. Are you here to help? In a manner of speaking. Hayes settled into a chair with the casual confidence of a man who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. I've been investigating irregularities in mining claims throughout the territory. Your situation has drawn my attention to certain patterns in Sacramento County. Tom leaned forward eagerly. What kind of patterns? Claims being jumped, documents disappearing, witnesses being intimidated or worse. The kind of systematic corruption that suggests official complicity at the highest levels. Eleanor felt a surge of hope. Then you'll support our case? Hayes's expression became apologetic. I'm afraid it's not that simple. My investigation is in its preliminary stages, and I can't interfere with ongoing local proceedings. However, he reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. I can provide you with copies of certain public records that might prove useful. Claims filings, territorial survey reports, correspondence between various officials. Eleanor opened the folder and scanned the documents. Many contained references to Blackwood's operations, and several seemed to contradict his official statements about property ownership and development. This is helpful, she said, but without official support. Mrs. Whitmore, let me be frank. Your case has attracted attention beyond Sacramento. There are people in San Francisco, in Washington even, who are watching to see whether the rule of law means anything in California's gold country. Hayes stood to leave. Whatever happens tomorrow, you won't be fighting alone. After Hayes departed, Eleanor and Tom spent the afternoon incorporating the new documents into their case strategy. The additional evidence strengthened their position, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were still David facing Goliath, armed with nothing but stones and stubborn courage. Tom, she said as they finished their preparations, what are our real chances? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at Sacramento's bustling streets. Honestly, if this were a fair fight in a legitimate court, I'd say we had better than even odds. Your evidence is solid, your case is strong, and you've prepared well. But this isn't a fair fight, and Harrison's court is about as legitimate as a $3 bill. Tom turned back to her with an expression of grim determination. Our real chance isn't in winning Harrison's legal judgment, it's in winning the battle for public opinion. If we can show the town who Blackwood really is, if we can demonstrate that the law means nothing when it conflicts with his interests, then maybe we can create enough pressure to force a real investigation. Exactly. Tomorrow isn't really about your mining claim, Eleanor. It's about whether California is going to be ruled by law or by whoever has the most guns and gold. Eleanor looked down at her carefully prepared notes, her meticulously organized evidence, her husband's legacy documents that had started this whole desperate venture. Tomorrow, she would walk into that courtroom and face down the most powerful man in 3 counties, armed with nothing but the truth and the fading hope that truth still mattered. Tom. Yes? Thank you for everything. His smile was sad, but genuine. Thank you, Eleanor. You've reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place. As night fell over Sacramento, Eleanor sat alone in her small room, listening to the sounds of a town settling into sleep. Somewhere out there, Cornelius Blackwood was preparing for tomorrow's battle, confident in his power and secure in his corruption. By this time tomorrow, one of them would be destroyed. Eleanor intended to make sure it wasn't her. The Sacramento County Courthouse had been built with territorial ambitions that far exceeded its actual grandeur. The main courtroom could hold perhaps 60 people if they squeezed together like sardines, and this morning it was packed beyond capacity. Eleanor could feel the weight of hostile stares as she made her way to the plaintiff's table, her black silk dress rustling with each step. Judge Harrison presided from his elevated bench, like a buzzard surveying carrion. He was a thin man with sharp features and the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent more time in saloons than courtrooms. His eyes followed Eleanor's progress with undisguised contempt. At the defendant's table, Cornelius Blackwood sat flanked by 2 lawyers from San Francisco, expensive men in expensive suits, who radiated the confidence that came from never having lost a case they were paid to win. Blackwood himself wore his finest clothes, transforming himself from frontier gold baron to respectable businessman for the occasion. Tom Brennan had positioned himself in the front row of spectators, close enough to offer whispered advice, but far enough away to avoid accusations of unauthorized practice. Mary sat beside him, her presence a welcome anchor in the sea of unfriendly faces. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Harrison," the bailiff announced. Eleanor stood with the rest of the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. 6 months ago, she'd been planning charity tea parties and worrying about proper place settings. Now she was about to face down the most powerful man in 3 counties in a legal battle that could determine not just her future, but the future of everyone who dared to stand against corruption in California's gold country. "Be seated," Harrison commanded. His voice carried the authority of his position, but Eleanor detected something else underneath. Nervousness, perhaps, or uncertainty. Even corrupt judges, it seemed, didn't relish presiding over cases that attracted attention from San Francisco. This court is now in session in the matter of Eleanor Whitmore versus Cornelius Blackwood, concerning disputed ownership of mining claims in Sacramento County. Harrison shuffled through papers with bureaucratic precision. "Mrs. Whitmore, as plaintiff, you may present your opening statement." Eleanor rose, her legs unsteady, but her voice clear. "Your Honor, members of the community, I stand before you today not as a grieving widow seeking charity, but as a legal heir claiming property that rightfully belongs to me under the laws of California and the United States." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the packed courtroom. 6 months ago, my husband Henry Whitmore died in Boston, leaving behind what I believe to be a modest estate and a comfortable but unremarkable legacy. Only after his death did I discover documents proving that he had invested substantial sums in California mining operations, specifically a 40% partnership in the Golden Hope mine with the defendant, Cornelius Blackwood. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Eleanor had expected skepticism, but the sound held more curiosity than hostility. Perhaps Tom had been right about the power of a compelling narrative. "I have come to California not to make wild accusations or pursue frivolous claims, but to exercise my legal rights as my husband's heir. The evidence I will present today will show that this partnership was legally established, properly documented, and has been deliberately concealed by Mr. Blackwood for his own financial benefit." Eleanor returned to her table and picked up the partnership agreement. Furthermore, I will demonstrate that Mr. Blackwood's attempts to deny this partnership have included intimidation, arson, and the systematic suppression of evidence, actions that reveal not the behavior of an innocent man, but of someone desperate to conceal the truth. She sat down to silence. Harrison's expression remained neutral, but she caught Blackwood leaning forward to whisper urgently to his lead attorney. "Mr. Blackwood," Harrison said, "your response." The lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Pemberton, who radiated expensive competence, rose smoothly. "Your Honor, my client is the victim of an elaborate fraud perpetrated by unscrupulous individuals seeking to exploit Mrs. Whitmore's grief for their own financial gain." Pemberton's voice carried the polished authority of a man accustomed to swaying juries and judges alike. "The so-called evidence Mrs. Whitmore presents consists entirely of forged documents created after her husband's death. Mr. Blackwood had no business relationship whatsoever with Henry Whitmore, and any suggestion otherwise is both false and defamatory." He gestured toward Eleanor with practiced disdain. "This case represents nothing more than an attempt to use this court to legitimize theft. We ask that Your Honor dismiss these baseless claims and restore Mr. Blackwood's good name." Harrison nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Whitmore, present your evidence." Eleanor stood and approached the bench, carrying the leather portfolio that contained her husband's documents. "Your Honor, I offer into evidence the partnership agreement between Henry Whitmore and Cornelius Blackwood, dated March 15, 1849, and duly notarized by Samuel Brooks of Boston." She handed the document to Harrison, who examined it with the perfunctory attention of a man whose mind was already made up. "Mr. Pemberton, your objection?" "Your Honor, this document is an obvious forgery. My client has never seen it before, and the signature purporting to be his is clearly fake." Eleanor felt her first stab of real panic. Without additional corroboration, it would be her word against Blackwood's, and she knew whose word Harrison would choose to believe. "Your Honor," she said quickly, "I also offer the financial records showing the transfer of funds from my husband's Boston bank to Mr. Blackwood's accounts, as well as correspondence detailing the terms of their partnership." She handed over the additional documents, watching Harrison's face for any sign that the weight of evidence might sway him. His expression remained studiously neutral. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, "these documents are witnessed by Jacob Morse, Mr. Blackwood's own accountant, who can testify to their authenticity." "Where is Mr. Morse?" Harrison asked. Eleanor's heart sank. "He was unable to attend today's proceedings." Pemberton's smile was sharp as a blade. "How convenient. The key witness to Mrs. Whitmore's supposed evidence is mysteriously absent." "Mr. Morse's absence is not mysterious," Eleanor replied, her temper flaring. "His house was burned down 3 days ago, shortly after Mr. Blackwood learned that Mr. Morse might testify on my behalf." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Harrison's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Order! Mrs. Whitmore, do you have any evidence linking Mr. Blackwood to this alleged arson?" Eleanor's mouth went dry. "Not direct evidence, Your Honor, but the timing is purely coincidental," Pemberton interrupted. "Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore is now accusing my client of arson based on nothing but speculation and innuendo." Harrison nodded gravely. "The court finds no evidence linking Mr. Blackwood to any criminal activity. Mrs. Whitmore, confine yourself to relevant testimony." Eleanor felt the case slipping away from her like sand through her fingers. She returned to her table and picked up another document, one of the territorial survey reports Hayes had provided. "Your Honor, I offer this territorial survey report showing that the land described in my husband's partnership agreement corresponds exactly to the current boundaries of the Golden Hope mine." Pemberton was on his feet immediately. "Objection. This survey report has no bearing on the authenticity of Mrs. Whitmore's alleged partnership agreement." Sustained. Eleanor tried a different approach. "Your Honor, I also offer bank records from Boston showing substantial transfers of funds from my husband's accounts to California mining operation." Objection. These records prove only that Mr. Whitmore invested in California mining generally, not that he had any specific partnership with my client. Sustained. Eleanor felt desperation rising in her chest. Every piece of evidence she presented was being dismissed on technical grounds, while Harrison showed no interest in examining the substance of her claims. "Your Honor," she said, her voice rising, "if I may address the court's concerns about the authenticity of these documents." "Mrs. Whitmore," Harrison interrupted, "this court has heard sufficient evidence. Mr. Pemberton, present your defense." Eleanor sank into her chair, watching helplessly as Pemberton rose to deliver what would surely be the killing blow. "Your Honor, my client's position is simple. He has never had any business relationship with Henry Whitmore. The documents Mrs. Whitmore presents are crude forgeries, created by persons unknown for the purpose of defrauding my client." Pemberton produced a document of his own. "I offer into evidence this affidavit from a handwriting expert in San Francisco, confirming that the signature on Mrs. Whitmore's alleged partnership agreement was not written by my client." Eleanor started to object, then realized she had no grounds for doing so. She wasn't a lawyer, and she had no expert witnesses of her own. "Furthermore," Pemberton continued, "I offer testimony from Mr. Blackwood himself regarding his complete lack of knowledge concerning any such partnership." Blackwood rose and approached the witness chair with the confident bearing of a man who knew the game was rigged in his favor. After being sworn in, he settled himself comfortably and smiled at the crowd. "Mr. Blackwood," Pemberton began, "did you ever have any business relationship with Henry Whitmore of Boston?" "No, sir. Never heard the name before this week." "Have you ever seen the document Mrs. Whitmore claims is a partnership agreement between you and her husband?" "Never. That signature isn't mine, and I never agreed to any such partnership." "In your opinion, what is Mrs. Whitmore's motivation for making these false claims?" Eleanor started to object, then realized that in representing herself, she had no standing to object to opinion testimony. "I can only assume," Blackwood said with practiced sorrow, "that someone has taken advantage of Mrs. Whitmore's grief to convince her these forged documents are genuine. It's a terrible thing when people prey on widows." Eleanor felt sick. Blackwood was painting himself as the victim while portraying her as either a fool or a fraud. She could see in the faces around her that his performance was effective. "No further questions," Pemberton announced. Harrison turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you wish to cross-examine the witness?" This was her moment. Perhaps her only chance to break through Blackwood's facade and show the courtroom who he really was. Eleanor rose slowly, her mind racing through everything Tom had taught her about questioning hostile witnesses. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "you testified that you never heard my husband's name before this week. Is that correct?" "That's right." Eleanor approached the witness stand, carrying one of the bank records Hayes had provided. "Then perhaps you can explain this deposit record from the Bank of California, showing a transfer of $50,000 from H. Whitmore of Boston to your personal account in March of 1849. Blackwood's eyes flicked to the document, and Eleanor caught a flash of something, surprise perhaps, or concern. "I receive investments from many sources. I don't memorize every investor's name." $50,000, and you don't remember the investor's name? "I do a lot of business, Mrs. Whitmore." Eleanor felt a surge of confidence. She was getting to him. "Mr. Blackwood, would you say $50,000 was a significant investment in 1849? "It was substantial, yes. Substantial enough to require legal documentation? A partnership agreement, perhaps?" Pemberton rose. "Objection! The witness has already testified that no such agreement existed." Sustained. Eleanor changed tactics. "Mr. Blackwood, you've testified that you believe someone has forged these documents to take advantage of my grief. Who do you think would do such a thing?" Blackwood's smile was cold. "I couldn't say. There are always unscrupulous people looking to profit from others' misfortune." And in your experience, are such people typically lawyers, bankers, the kind of people who would have access to official seals and notary stamps? I suppose so. Eleanor pulled out another document from Hayes's folder, one she'd saved for this moment. Mr. Blackwood, are you familiar with the land survey conducted by the territorial government last year? Generally, yes. Are you aware that this survey shows significant discrepancies between your claimed property boundaries and what's actually on file with the territorial authority? Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. I'm not familiar with the details of that survey. Really? Because according to this report, you've been mining on federal land without proper authorization. Land that was specifically excluded from your original claims. Pemberton was on his feet. Objection. This line of questioning is irrelevant to the matter at hand. Your Honor, Eleanor said quickly, it goes to the witness's credibility and his pattern of questionable business practices. Harrison looked annoyed. Sustained. Mrs. Whitmore, confine your questions to the alleged partnership. Eleanor felt her momentum slipping, but she had one more arrow in her quiver. Mr. Blackwood, you testified that you've never seen the partnership agreement I presented. Are you certain about that? Absolutely certain. Then perhaps you can explain why your accountant, Jacob Morse, signed it as a witness. For the first time, Blackwood hesitated. Jacob signs many documents. He might have been confused about witnessing a legal partnership agreement involving 40% of your most valuable property. Mrs. Whitmore, Harrison interrupted, the witness has answered your question. But Eleanor pressed on, sensing weakness. Mr. Blackwood, isn't it true that you've been trying to prevent Mr. Morse from testifying in this case? That's ridiculous. Isn't it true that you stationed guards at his house to intimidate him? I don't know what you're talking about. And isn't it true that when intimidation failed, you had his house burned down to ensure his silence? The courtroom erupted. Blackwood shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. That's a damned lie! Order! Harrison's gavel cracked repeatedly. Mrs. Whitmore, you will not make unsupported accusations in this court. But the damage was done. Eleanor had succeeded in showing the crowd a different side of Cornelius Blackwood, not the injured businessman, but the angry, dangerous man who lurked beneath the surface. No further questions, she said, returning to her seat with satisfaction. Harrison looked ready to end the proceedings immediately, but before he could speak, a commotion arose at the back of the courtroom. The crowd parted to reveal a small, nervous man making his way forward. Jacob Morse had arrived. Eleanor's heart leaped as she recognized Blackwood's accountant. Behind him came two more unexpected figures. District Attorney Hayes and a man Eleanor didn't recognize wearing a federal marshal's badge. Your Honor, Morse called out, his voice shaking but determined. I have testimony relevant to this case. Harrison looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Mr. Morse, this court is not... Your Honor, Hayes interrupted, stepping forward with official authority. I'm District Attorney William Hayes from San Francisco. Mr. Morse has been placed under federal protection as a witness in an ongoing investigation into territorial mining fraud. I respectfully request that the court hear his testimony. Eleanor felt the entire courtroom hold its breath. Harrison's eyes darted between Hayes, the federal marshal, and Blackwood, whose face had gone pale as winter snow. This is highly irregular, Harrison said weakly. Yes, sir, it is, the federal marshal agreed. But federal law supersedes territorial procedure when it comes to witness protection. Mr. Morse has evidence relevant to this case and to our broader investigation. Harrison looked trapped. Eleanor realized that whatever hold Blackwood had over the local authorities, it didn't extend to federal officials. Very well, Harrison said reluctantly. Mr. Morse, approach the bench. Morse walked forward on unsteady legs, his eyes carefully avoiding Blackwood's furious stare. After being sworn in, he settled into the witness chair like a man preparing for execution. Mr. Morse, Eleanor said, her voice ringing with new confidence, what is your occupation? I'm an accountant. I maintain financial records for various mining operations in Sacramento County, including Mr. Blackwood's operations? Yes, ma'am. For the past 5 years. Eleanor approached the witness stand with the partnership agreement. Mr. Morse, do you recognize this document? Morse examined the paper with trembling hands. Yes, ma'am. I witnessed this agreement between Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Henry Whitmore of Boston. A collective gasp rose from the courtroom. Blackwood's face had gone from pale to red, and Eleanor could see his hands clenched into fists. Can you tell the court about the circumstances under which this agreement was signed? Mr. Blackwood was facing financial difficulties in early 1849. He was about to lose his claims for non-payment of fees and loans. Mr. Whitmore's investment saved his operation. And the terms of this partnership? 40% ownership to Mr. Whitmore in exchange for his investment with Mr. Whitmore to remain a silent partner. Upon Mr. Whitmore's death, his share was to revert to his heirs. Eleanor felt triumph surging through her veins. Mr. Morse, has Mr. Blackwood been aware of Mr. Whitmore's death? Yes, ma'am. We received notification 6 months ago. Mr. Blackwood instructed me to prepare documents dissolving the partnership, but then decided against filing them. Why? Morse's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Because we discovered a new vein on the property last month, the richest strike anyone's seen since the rush started. Mr. Blackwood said he wasn't going to share that kind of wealth with some Eastern widow. The courtroom exploded. Harrison's gavel was lost in the roar of shocked voices and angry shouts. Eleanor saw Blackwood leap to his feet, his face contorted with rage, his hand moving toward his coat. But before he could draw whatever weapon he carried, the federal marshal was beside him, one hand on Blackwood's wrist and the other on his own gun. I wouldn't, Mr. Blackwood, the marshal said calmly, not in front of all these witnesses. Gradually, the courtroom quieted. Harrison, looking like a man who'd seen his comfortable world collapse, struggled to regain control. Mr. Morse, he said weakly, are you certain about this testimony? Yes, sir. I have all the financial records to prove it. Bank transfers, correspondence, survey reports, everything. Eleanor felt the tide of battle shift decisively in her favor, but she knew this was just the beginning. Proving her case was one thing. Surviving Blackwood's response would be another entirely. Your Honor, she said formally, I request that this court recognize my legal ownership of 40% of the Golden Hope mine and all associated properties, as established by the partnership agreement between my husband and Mr. Blackwood. Harrison looked around the packed courtroom, at the federal officials, at the crowd of townspeople who had witnessed Blackwood's mask slip away completely. Eleanor realized he was calculating, trying to determine which way the wind was blowing, and position himself accordingly. This court will take the matter under advisement, Harrison said finally. Given the complexity of the evidence and the federal interest in this case, I will render my decision tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. As the crowd began to file out, Eleanor remained seated, scarcely able to believe what had just happened. 6 days ago, she'd been a grieving widow with nothing but questionable documents and desperate courage. Now she'd exposed Cornelius Blackwood's corruption in front of half the county and won the support of federal authorities. But as she watched Blackwood push through the crowd toward the exit, his eyes fixed on her with undisguised hatred, she knew the real fight was just beginning. He'd tried intimidation, arson, and legal manipulation. Tomorrow, she suspected, he would try something far more direct. Eleanor barely slept that night. Every creak of the boarding house, every sound from the street below, made her heart race with the expectation of violence. Mary had insisted on sharing her room, positioning herself in a chair by the door with a shotgun across her lap, a precaution that Eleanor found both comforting and terrifying. He won't try anything tonight, Mary said during one of Eleanor's restless moments. Too many people watching now. But tomorrow, after the judge rules. Eleanor didn't need her to finish the thought. Win or lose, Cornelius Blackwood would not let this stand. Men like him didn't simply accept defeat. They eliminated the source of their problems. Dawn brought news that crystallized Eleanor's fears. Tom arrived at the boarding house with Samuel Morrison, the young reporter, whose face was grim with purpose. "Mrs. Whitmore," Morrison said without preamble, "I thought you should know. 3 of Blackwood's men left town last night, headed north toward the mining camps." Eleanor felt ice in her veins. "Why north?" "Because that's where the federal marshal took Jacob Morse for protection," Tom explained. "Blackwood's not waiting for the legal process to conclude. He's taking direct action." Mary stood up from her post by the window. "We have to warn them." "Already done," Morrison said. "Sent word ahead with the morning stage, but it's a day's ride to the federal camp, and Blackwood's men had a head start." Eleanor paced the small parlor, her mind racing. Yesterday's victory in court suddenly felt hollow. What good was legal vindication if the key witness disappeared before the judge could render his decision? "There's something else," Morrison continued. "Word around town is that Blackwood's called in favors from as far away as San Francisco. Hired guns, the kind that specialize in making problems disappear permanently." Tom ran his hands through his hair. "Eleanor, maybe it's time to consider Hayes's offer." Eleanor stopped pacing. "What offer?" "Federal protection. Hayes mentioned it yesterday. They could take you back to San Francisco, keep you safe while they build their larger case against Blackwood." "You mean run away?" "I mean survive." Eleanor looked around at the 3 people who had become her unlikely allies in this desperate venture. Mary, who had lost her husband to Blackwood's greed but still found the courage to fight back. Tom, who had sacrificed his career and nearly his life to help her seek justice. Morrison, who risked Blackwood's wrath simply by reporting the truth. "No," she said firmly, "I didn't come 3,000 miles to turn tail at the first sign of real danger." "Indeed, Eleanor," Mary said gently, "this isn't about courage anymore. This is about staying alive." "What's the point of staying alive if it means letting men like Blackwood continue to terrorize entire communities?" Eleanor moved to the window and looked out at Sacramento's bustling streets. "If I run now, what happens to the next person who stands up to him? Or the person after that?" Tom joined her at the window. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we finish this. Today. Before Blackwood has a chance to eliminate Morse or intimidate Judge Harrison into changing his ruling." Morrison looked puzzled. "How do you propose to do that?" Eleanor turned back to face them, her expression set with determination. "By making sure the entire territory knows what happened in that courtroom yesterday. Morrison, can you get word to newspapers in San Francisco, Sacramento, even back east? It'll take time. Not if we give them something dramatic enough to warrant immediate attention." Eleanor began pacing again, her mind working furiously. What if Cornelius Blackwood's corruption was exposed not just in a courtroom, but in front of hundreds of witnesses? What if the truth came out in a way that couldn't be suppressed or denied? Mary's eyes lit up with understanding. "The Miners' Assembly." Tom looked blank. "What's the Miners' Assembly?" "Monthly gathering of all the claim holders in the county," Mary explained. "Supposed to be this afternoon at the courthouse square. Blackwood usually presides over it like he's some kind of elected official." Eleanor felt excitement building. What if this month's assembly heard a different kind of presentation? "Eleanor," Tom said slowly, "you're talking about confronting Blackwood in front of his own supporters, on his own ground. That's not brave. That's suicidal." "Maybe. Or maybe it's the one thing he won't expect." Eleanor turned to Morrison. "Can you guarantee coverage? Make sure what happens gets reported accurately?" Morrison nodded grimly. "I can do better than that. I can arrange for reporters from San Francisco to be there. This story's gotten big enough to attract attention from the major papers." Eleanor felt the familiar thrill of fear and excitement that had become her constant companion since arriving in California. "Then that's what we'll do." Mary moved to her side. What exactly are you planning? I'm planning to tell the truth. In public, in front of witnesses, with the evidence to back it up. Eleanor's voice gained strength as the plan crystallized in her mind. Blackwood's power comes from secrecy and intimidation. Strip those away, force him to defend himself in daylight, and maybe we'll discover he's not as invincible as he pretends to be. Tom shook his head. Eleanor, I admire your courage, but this is madness. Blackwood won't just stand there and let you destroy his reputation. No, he won't, which is why we need to be very careful about how we do this. Eleanor moved to her traveling case and began pulling out documents, not just her husband's partnership papers, but all the additional evidence Hayes had provided, plus notes from their court preparation and copies of everything Jacob Morse had corroborated. We make copies of everything, she said, multiple copies distributed to different people before the assembly begins. Even if Blackwood destroys some of the evidence, enough will survive to tell the story. Morrison was already reaching for his notebook. What about security? Blackwood's men will be outnumbered if we play this right. Eleanor's plan was becoming clearer by the moment. Morrison, can you get word to the federal authorities? Make sure they know what's happening and when. Consider it done. Mary checked her shotgun with practiced efficiency. What about us? We'll be sitting ducks out there. Eleanor met her friend's steady gaze. Mary, you've done enough. More than enough. You don't have to— Don't even finish that sentence, Mary interrupted. I've been waiting 2 years for someone to stand up to Blackwood. You think I'm going to miss the finale? Tom sighed heavily. If we're really going to do this, we need to be smart about it. Blackwood will try to control the narrative, paint you as a hysterical woman making wild accusations. We need to present the evidence systematically, logically, in a way that even his supporters can't dismiss. Eleanor felt a surge of affection for the broken-down lawyer who had found his principles again just when she needed them most. What do you suggest? Tom began sketching on a piece of paper. Structure it like a legal presentation. Start with the basic facts, your husband's investment, the partnership agreement, the timeline of events. Then present the corroborating evidence, bank records, territorial surveys, Morse's testimony. Build the case step by step so that by the time you reach the accusations of corruption and intimidation, the foundation is already established. And if Blackwood tries to interrupt or discredit me, let him. In front of a crowd like that, aggressive interruption will make him look guilty and you look sympathetic. Tom's smile was grim but determined. Besides, after yesterday's performance in court, people are already starting to see through his facade. Eleanor spent the next hour organizing her presentation, while Mary and Morrison spread word through Sacramento's network of boarding houses, saloons, and shops. The miners' assembly was typically a sparsely attended affair, where Blackwood announced policies and settled disputes with the authority of a feudal lord. This afternoon's gathering would be very different. By noon, Eleanor was as ready as she could be. Her evidence was organized, her arguments prepared, and multiple copies of key documents were safely distributed among allies throughout the town. She had changed into her best dress, the black silk that struck the right balance between respectability and mourning, and pinned her hair with particular care. She was, she realized, dressing for what might be the last performance of her life. Eleanor, Mary said as they prepared to leave for the courthouse square, I want you to know, whatever happens today, you've already won. How do you figure that? Mary's smile was fierce with pride. Because 6 months ago, Cornelius Blackwood was the undisputed king of Sacramento County. Today, he's a man fighting for his reputation in front of hundreds of people who've finally seen him for what he really is. You did that. A proper Boston widow who came west with nothing but grief and determination. Eleanor felt tears threatening. I couldn't have done any of it without you, without all of you. That's what makes it even better, Tom added. He's not being brought down by another powerful man or some government conspiracy. He's being brought down by ordinary people who decided they'd had enough. As they walked toward the courthouse square, Eleanor could see that word of the afternoon's drama had spread throughout Sacramento. The crowd gathering around the makeshift speaker's platform was easily 3 times larger than usual, and the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Near the platform, Cornelius Blackwood stood surrounded by his remaining supporters, hard-faced men whose loyalty had been purchased with gold and maintained through fear. But Eleanor noticed something different in their bearing, a subtle uncertainty that hadn't been there a week ago. Blackwood himself looked like a man under siege. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the watchful tension of a predator who suddenly realized he might become prey. As Eleanor approached the platform, the crowd parted to let her through. She could feel dozens of eyes tracking her movement, hear the whispered conversations that followed in her wake. By tonight, everyone in 3 counties would know what happened here. The question was whether she would survive to see how the story ended. Blackwood's eyes found hers across the crowd, and Eleanor saw something in them that made her blood run cold. Not anger or fear, but calculation. The look of a man who had decided that talking was finished. Eleanor climbed the steps to the platform and faced the largest crowd she had ever addressed. In the distance, she could see Morrison with his notebook ready, Tom and Mary positioned strategically near the front and scattered throughout the assembly, the faces of people who had risked their own safety to help her reach this moment. It was time to finish what Henry's death had started. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the square, "I have come here today to tell you the truth about Cornelius Blackwood." Eleanor's words cut through the afternoon air like a blade through silk. The murmur of conversation died instantly, leaving only the sound of her voice and the distant clatter of Sacramento's streets. "For too long, this community has lived under the shadow of one man's greed and corruption," she continued, her confidence growing with each word. "Today, that shadow ends." She pulled out the partnership agreement and held it high enough for the crowd to see. "This document proves that my late husband, Henry Whitmore of Boston, was a 40% partner in the Golden Hope mine, Mr. Blackwood's supposed crown jewel." Blackwood stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to listen to the hysterical accusations of some grief-addled widow." But instead of the supportive murmurs he clearly expected, the crowd remained silent, waiting to hear more. Eleanor saw his surprise at this reaction and pressed her advantage. "Mr. Blackwood, if these are the accusations of a grief-addled widow, why did you station armed guards at Jacob Morse's house to prevent him from testifying? Why did his home burn down immediately after he agreed to support my claims?" "That's," Blackwood began, but Eleanor didn't let him finish. "Why did your own accountant confirm under oath that you've been deliberately concealing this partnership for 6 months, specifically to avoid sharing the wealth from the new gold strike?" She pulled out the bank records Hayes had provided. "These documents show a $50,000 transfer from my husband's Boston accounts to Blackwood's operations in March of 1849. $50,000, ladies and gentlemen, enough to save Mr. Blackwood from bankruptcy and establish him as the most powerful man in the county." A murmur began to rise from the crowd, not the hostile muttering Eleanor had expected, but the sound of people beginning to understand the scope of what they were hearing. "None of this proves anything," Blackwood shouted. "Documents can be forged, testimony can be bought." "Then explain this," Eleanor interrupted, pulling out one of the territorial survey reports. "This federal survey shows that you've been mining on government land without proper authorization, land specifically excluded from your original claims." She turned to address the crowd directly. "How many of you have had claims jumped by Mr. Blackwood's men? How many have lost property because you couldn't afford his legal fees or his bribes?" The crowd stirred restlessly. Eleanor could see recognition dawning on faces throughout the assembly, the recognition of their own experiences reflected in her accusations. "And how many of you have stayed silent because you were afraid of what would happen if you spoke out?" This time, The murmur was louder, more charged with emotion. Eleanor realized she had touched something fundamental, the accumulated resentment of people who had been powerless for too long. Blackwood sensed the shift in mood as well. His hand moved inside his coat, and Eleanor caught the glint of metal. But before he could draw whatever weapon he carried, a new voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Cornelius." District Attorney Hayes emerged from the crowd, flanked by 2 federal marshals and followed by Jacob Morse. The accountant looked haggard but determined, carrying a leather satchel that Eleanor knew contained the financial records that would corroborate everything she had said. "Mr. Hayes," Blackwood said, his voice strained, "what's the meaning of this?" "The meaning, Cornelius, is that your little kingdom is coming to an end." Hayes stepped onto the platform with official authority. "Mr. Morse has provided us with detailed financial records documenting not just your partnership with Henry Whitmore, but a pattern of fraud, intimidation, and corruption stretching back 5 years. He gestured to the marshals. "You're under arrest for territorial fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder." "Attempted murder?" Eleanor's voice rose in shock. Hayes nodded grimly. 3 of Blackwood's men were intercepted this morning on their way to eliminate Mr. Morse. They were quite talkative once they realized they were facing federal charges. The crowd erupted. Eleanor heard shouts of anger, cries of vindication, and underneath it all the sound of a community finally finding its voice after years of enforced silence. But Blackwood wasn't finished. With the desperate fury of a cornered animal, he lunged toward Eleanor, the knife in his hand gleaming in the afternoon sun. The blade never reached her. Mary O'Sullivan's shotgun blast echoed across the courthouse square like thunder, and Blackwood crumpled to the platform, clutching his shoulder and screaming in pain and rage. "That's for my Patrick," Mary said quietly, lowering the smoking weapon. In the chaos that followed, Eleanor found herself surrounded by people, some offering congratulations, others simply wanting to touch the woman who had brought down the county's most powerful man. But through it all, she felt oddly detached, as if she were watching someone else's story unfold. It wasn't until later, after Blackwood had been arrested and taken away, after the crowd had dispersed and the initial excitement had died down, that the full impact of what had happened began to sink in. She was sitting in the boarding house parlor with Mary and Tom when Samuel Morrison arrived with the final edition of the Sacramento Union. The headline read, "Gold Baron's Empire Crumbles. Boston Widow Exposes Massive Fraud." "It's going out on the wire tonight," Morrison said with satisfaction. "By morning, newspapers from San Francisco to New York will be carrying the story." Eleanor stared at the headline, still struggling to believe it was real. What happens now? Tom leaned back in his chair with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since they'd met. "Now, Mrs. Whitmore, you become a very wealthy woman. The Golden Hope mine, plus damages for Blackwood's attempts to defraud you, plus compensation for his other victims. We're talking about a fortune that would make you one of the richest people in California. And Blackwood, federal prison, assuming he survives his trial. The evidence against him is overwhelming, and his hired guns are already testifying against him in exchange for reduced sentences." Eleanor nodded slowly, but her mind was elsewhere. Wealth had never been her goal in this fight. Justice had been, and vindication for Henry's memory. Now that she had both, she wasn't sure what came next. "Eleanor," Mary said gently, "you could go home now. Back to Boston. Back to your old life." Eleanor considered this. Her old life seemed as distant as a half-remembered dream. The woman who had worried about proper tea service and charity committee meetings had died somewhere between Sacramento and Courage. "I don't think I could," she said finally. "Boston feels like another world now. And besides," she gestured around the modest parlor, where she had found friendship and purpose among people who had shown her what real courage looked like. "Besides, I think California might need more proper Boston widows willing to cause trouble." Mary's laugh was rich with delight. "Lord help us all." As the evening settled over Sacramento, Eleanor stood at her window, looking out at the streets where she had faced down the most powerful man in 3 counties and won. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, managing her unexpected wealth, helping rebuild a community that had been terrorized for too long, perhaps even exploring what possibilities existed for a woman who had discovered her own strength. But tonight, she was content to savor a truth that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. Sometimes, even rusty pans could prove more valuable than gold. Epilogue. 6 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site where the new Sacramento hospital was taking shape. Eleanor stood at the edge of the organized chaos, watching workers lay the foundation for what would be the finest medical facility between San Francisco and Carson City. Mrs. Whitmore, she turned to find Tom Brennan approaching, looking remarkably different from the broken-down drunk she had first met in the grimy office above Chen's Laundry. Clean-shaven and sober, wearing a proper suit and carrying the authoritative bearing of a man who had reclaimed his self-respect. He had become her legal advisor and, more importantly, her friend. "The contractor wants to know about the windows for the surgical ward," Tom said. "The larger ones will add to the cost, but order the larger ones," Eleanor said without hesitation. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." Tom made a note in his ledger. "At this rate, the hospital will cost more than some people spend on entire mining operations." Eleanor smiled. "Good. This community deserves better than good enough." The hospital was just one of several projects Eleanor had undertaken with her newfound wealth. There was also the school being built on Front Street, the fund she had established to help widows and orphans, and the legal aid society that provided free representation to minors being cheated by unscrupulous claim jumpers. Sacramento was being transformed, and Eleanor found the work far more satisfying than managing charitable tea parties had ever been. "Any word from San Francisco?" she asked. Tom's expression grew serious. "Blackwood's trial is set for next month. Hayes is confident of conviction on all charges, especially since 3 more witnesses have come forward with evidence of intimidation and fraud." Eleanor nodded, though she felt little satisfaction at the prospect of Blackwood's final defeat. The man himself had become almost irrelevant, a broken figure whose empire had crumbled the moment his victims found the courage to speak truth to power. "Mrs. Whitmore! Mrs. Whitmore!" They turned to see Mary O'Sullivan hurrying toward them, her face bright with excitement. She carried a telegram in her hand and moved with the quick energy of someone bearing important news. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. Mary waved the telegram triumphantly. "From the territorial governor himself. He's formally requesting that you consider a position as advisor on mining regulations for the entire territory." Eleanor stared at the yellow paper. "He wants me to help write the laws." "Makes sense," Tom said thoughtfully. "You've become something of an expert on mining fraud, and your reputation for honesty is already legendary throughout California." Eleanor read the telegram twice, still hardly believing what it said. 6 months ago, she had been a proper Boston widow whose greatest concern was whether the silver tea service was polished to appropriate brightness. Now the territorial government was asking her to help shape the laws that would govern California's mining industry. "What do you think?" Mary asked. Eleanor looked around at the hospital construction, thought about the school taking shape across town, considered the dozens of families who had already benefited from her various charitable endeavors. She had built a life here that had meaning and purpose beyond anything she had known in Boston. "I think," she said slowly, "that California is exactly where I belong." Mary's grin was radiant. "Wait until the folks back in Boston hear that their proper widow has become a territorial advisor." Eleanor laughed, imagining the shock among her former social circle. "I suppose they'll say I've gone completely native." "Have you?" Tom asked with amusement. Eleanor considered this as she watched the workers laying stone for what would soon be a symbol of hope and healing in a community that had been terrorized for too long. She thought about the journey that had brought her from grief and confusion to purpose and strength, from a woman who had never questioned the comfortable assumptions of her privileged life to someone who fought for justice regardless of the personal cost. "Yes," she said finally, "I suppose I have." As the three friends walked back toward town, planning the day's work and discussing the challenges ahead, Eleanor reflected on the strange turns that life could take. She had come west, seeking answers about her husband's secret life, and instead had discovered her own capacity for courage. The rusty pan Cornelius Blackwood had compared her to had indeed proved its worth, not in gold, but in something far more valuable. The knowledge that even ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Behind them, the sound of hammers and saws continued as Sacramento built its future. And at the heart of that construction, Eleanor Whitmore, former Boston widow, current California pioneer, had found her place in a world that was wider and more wonderful than she had ever dared to imagine. The gold rush had brought many people west in search of fortune. Eleanor had found something better. She had found herself. Eleanor Whitmore's journey from a grieving Boston widow to a powerful force for justice in California's gold country reminds us that our greatest strength often emerges in our darkest moments. When we have nothing left to lose, we discover everything we're capable of becoming. Her story proves that it's never too late to reinvent ourselves, stand up for what's right, and refuse to let others define our worth. What moment in your life revealed strength you didn't know you had? Have you ever had to choose between safety and doing what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how Eleanor's courage resonates with your own experiences. And if you enjoyed this tale of unexpected heroism and second chances, please subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories of ordinary people who achieved extraordinary things when they refused to back down.